right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending our Saturday Town Hall. I know that we have busy schedules, but we wanted to provide this space on Saturdays, knowing that people need to navigate between work schedules and family schedules. So today you'll be hearing from our Peace Collective, which is comprised of members from Gray Ed, Colorado, through Ed, YAASPA, which is Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism, and COCABE. And so today we'll first have Tramaine Duncan, who will update us on school closures and APS. Then from Dr. Trinidad-Sheahan, who will update us on DPS declining enrollment. And then we'll end with Dr. Sampson. We will listen to Dr. Sampson on culturally responsive curriculum. So at this time, I will pass it to Tramaine Duncan.
My bad, I'm still trying to get to a spot. I had to move, my kids were being too noisy. Can y'all hear me? Can you see me?
Tramaine, if you don't mind, one quick second so our interpreters can chime in and do a quick statement before we get started, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Indira Guzman, and I am here with my colleague, Kim Vo, and we are here to create a space for language justice. What that means is that we want everyone to engage and participate in the language of their hearts. So for this morning, we're going to have interpretation in English and in Vietnamese and in Spanish. So in a second, when we turn on interpretation, you will see an icon on the bottom of the screen that says interpretation. Please click on the icon and select the language that you prefer to engage in. For our Vietnamese participants, we will use the language for French because Vietnamese is not a setting on Zoom. So if you would like to hear this in Vietnamese, please click on French and then Spanish or English. I'll allow for Hien to say this in Vietnamese and then we'll get started. Hien, can you unmute your microphone and give the announcement?
Hello, đây là Hiển Võ và đây là mình đã bắt đầu vào thông dịch với đây bây giờ mà có ai mà có thể nghe được tiếng Việt thì hãy nhấn vào cái nút ở phía dưới là cái nút mà không có tiếng Việt nhưng mà bấm vào là của người Pháp French thì nhấn vào cái nút đó thì mọi người sẽ nghe được tiếng Việt. Xin chào.
Can we please turn on interpretation at this time?
Thank you. And now we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll go ahead and start with Mr. Tramaine Duncan of APS School Board.
Thank you guys for having me, or thank you all for having me this morning. Like it's been stated, I'm Tramaine Duncan, one of the directors with the APS Board of Education. I was asked to come and speak a little bit about our blueprint process, how it's going, and kind of some next steps moving forward. If you all have been paying attention to our school board meetings, our blueprint process is pretty much at a standstill right now. At our last board meeting, we chose to keep Paris and Sable open temporarily while we get more information about what the blueprint process is going to look like moving forward. We want to ensure that our superintendent is doing what he can or what he needs to be doing in order to get the community feedback that's needed in order for us to make informed decisions about how we educate our children within Aurora. I know at our next board meeting on May 17th, we'll have to bring that blueprint decision back to the table to either vote to close Paris and Sable, open the P-TECH on North Campus. I believe the superintendent may bring back a decision or an option for us to kind of restructure what the blueprint process looks like, which will require us to stop the blueprint process completely and reframe it and redraw it up together and with community, or just stop Blueprint altogether and figure something else out to consolidate and close our schools. The challenge with consolidating or scrapping Blueprint is that we've already spent close to $75 million tearing down schools, rebuilding new schools, displacing families and students. So some families already have gone through the process of their school being closed and their community being displaced. So to me, in my opinion, it wouldn't be a fair idea for us to just stop the process completely, especially when we have spent $75 million already and families have been displaced. So I believe those are the three options the superintendent is going to come back with. He hasn't sent them to us for sure, but that's just my guess. I know the community and family members from Sable and Paris have been coming to the board meetings, speaking their minds, showing that community is really behind their schools, and I appreciate it and I like it and I love to see it. However, I don't think we should set the precedence or the expectation that in order for you to keep your school open, all you need to do is show up and make noise at board meetings. The tough reality is that schools are going to have to close, whether we like it or not, and maybe not close, but consolidate or be repurposed into another entity to where the district is making money to be able to pay our educators and to provide programming for our students throughout the district. So I think that's it on my list of updates. I know they said there will be questions, so this is the time for me to answer any questions that you all may have.
So I have a question. How can we communicate to the community of like, how do they attend school board meetings? When do they happen? If they wanted to do testimony, like provide a testimonial, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, so we meet once per month. It's usually, and I could be mistaken, usually it's the third Tuesday of every month from 6 to 8 o'clock. However, since I've been elected to the school board, we've been meeting till about midnight every month. So most of the time is actually taken up by public comment. There's a lot of public comment that's been happening. You would just need to email our secretary, Claudia Blasick, and she will get you on a list to speak in front of the board. And that's usually how we hear concerns and whatnot from community members, or you can email us directly. And that's a way too, so.
Thank you. And I think just to follow up to that, sorry, my last question. What is APS doing to meet with community in their community to have these discussions around school closure?
So I know our superintendent has had town halls in a certain part or the regions that he's proposing school closures in. I don't know how populated those particular town halls have been. I've only been to a couple, and the one I went to wasn't too filled. So I don't know what they've been previously, but to my knowledge, those are been the only things that the superintendent has done to gain community input.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, Tramaine. It's Leslie Burton from Sable Elementary.
What's up, Leslie?
Hi, it's nice to see you. And hello, thank you for hosting this town hall. Great education. We really appreciate that. The Sable community is hosting an event on May 14th at noon to get our community and other communities in Region 1 together to discuss this exact issue. Our community members feel as though the district did not do a good job getting information to them prior to school closures or even when Blueprint started pre-pandemic and throughout the pandemic. So we are hosting an event. We would love for anyone in the Aurora community, anyone who cares about APS schools to be there. Tramaine, do you think you'll be able to attend?
You said if I'll be able to attend?
Yes, we're asking all board members to be there.
Yep, it's on my list of things to do next Saturday.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
I just want to put out into the room that there is a school closure happening at Wheeling Elementary in Aurora Public Schools this May. They were one of the schools that was shut down during the pandemic. And speaking to families at Wheeling, there are currently families at Wheeling Elementary right now that are still unaware that their school is closing in May, which just goes to show the lack of communication in APS to our families of color color to our families of to our working families and to our language learner families, our multilingual learners. So we hope that anyone in the community can come out to our event, where we're going to be speaking to all of the community in Region 1 about school closures and about Blueprint. It is negatively affecting our families and our community, and we hope that the board and the district team will consider a post-pandemic plan or reorganization of Blueprint moving forward. Thank you so much.
I have a question, Tramaine. Dr. Cynthia here. Will the turnaround process, if some of the schools are facing turnaround with CDE, is that going to affect the decisions on which schools will close? Because I know that, for example, Aurora Central High School has had, the turnaround process in effect for a few years, but there's been no discussion of Aurora Central or other schools. Is that pending or have any influence on the decisions?
No, according to our superintendent, and I just got elected in November, so I wasn't a part of the original Blueprint process, but according to our superintendent in the last board, they didn't want SPF scores to be taken into consideration when we're trying to close or reconsolidate schools. So no, SPF scores or schools on the cusp of failing are not being taken into consideration when school closure is being talked about.
Okay. And so then they haven't talked about what added supports they could give those schools should there be consolidations or closures?
No, ma'am. To be honest, I feel like that's what we should be talking about, is how we can increase our scores of all students across the district, not just our felon students. But Blueprint is taking so much of our time that we can't get to what we need to really be dealing with. So in my opinion, until we get Blueprint settled, everything else is going to take a backseat, because community is so invested in schools being closed and the repurposing of schools. So that needs to be addressed immediately, in my opinion.
Thank you.
So we have in the chat, please join us May 14th at noon at Sable Elementary. Many of our community members will be there, and other APS stakeholders will be there as well. We look forward to partnering with you, this very important issue in our community. We also need Board of Education members to speak up for our families. We already voted no, and just because a few people didn't like the outcome, they're bringing us to the table again. And the reason why I'm reading this is because we are being recorded, so those who didn't attend can be aware of what's happening in the chat. So I'll do 2 more minutes before we move on to our next presentation. So do we have any other questions for Mr. Duncan? Thank you. And Leslie, if you could email us some information so that way we can send it out to our community networks, that would be great.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. So at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Cynthia Trinidad-Sheahan, who will be speaking about the declining enrollment in Denver Public Schools. And Dr. Cynthia, you are muted.
Okay, so I put together a few slides just to kind of keep my thoughts straight, but it is by no means a presentation as such. But I am on the Declining Enrollment Committee. I am the Executive Director for the Colorado Association for Bilingual Education. We are supporters of our students, families, and educators across the state of Colorado, not just DPS, but right now, as you know, DPS has been a focus because of the declining enrollment. This is a sample calendar that was given to us as the committee, and this is the intended timeline. Since this came out, though, the timeline has also been altered. And the reason why is if you look at the part where it says accelerated timeline, is up to the superintendent and the Board of Ed. And so the last meeting we had this last week, it was shared that some of the consolidation and closures could be accelerated. there's a huge issue with this because of the fact that our parents of the schools, and there's 19 schools that are being considered for consolidation and closure, nobody has communicated with our Spanish-speaking families. There's been what they call some communication, but we have parents that are calling organizations because they do not understand, first of all, the process of how this is being developed for the criteria for the consolidation and closures of schools, and why there would be an acceleration of the closure or consolidation. Once again, because our families may be multilingual or monolingual, they are not being explained how October count works, how funding works, why declining enrollment is affecting their schools. What they're also not explaining is the consent decree. And so I put together just a quick slide. It's a quick summary of the consent decree. If you're not familiar with the modified consent decree that DPS is legally bound to and must use as a foundation for any big decisions of consolidation or closures of schools, or if there's any changes in programming to their schools. The very first decree went into effect in 1975, and then it was modified in 2012. And so this is a legal binding document that has effect on their programming. It includes the teachers, materials, educational materials that are emergent bilinguals, are English language learners enrolled in the district must have. And why it's important because our parents and our families need to understand that in this country, having access to quality and dignifying education is your child's right. And parents need to know that if those rights are being violated or programming is being taken away from their student, it is their civil right to approach the district and demand answers. And I say demand, not ask, because for a very long time, we have been asking for answers and only receiving breadcrumbs in what we're getting from the past superintendents, the present superintendent, and the boards. How can they advocate for their child's civil rights? We need to be sharing the decree. You figure if the first consent decree was in 1975, those families have already graduated from school, they've changed. Then here, 2012, the decree was modified. Well, those families have also had students that have graduated. We have new families coming in. We have new administrators. We have new superintendents. We have new educators. And so therefore it is who is then passing on the knowledge of what the consent decree is and the responsibility of the district to meet that decree. So we need to make sure that people are informed. This has been a hindrance on the committee. As I attend the meetings on Wednesdays, the very first meeting I asked if the facilitator, who's an outside entity, understood the decree. The facilitator didn't know what the consent decree was, nor had heard of the decree. That's a big issue. Many of the individuals that are on the committee were not familiar with the consent decree. And so that's an issue. If our new principals do not understand the decree, that's an issue, because then who's working with our parents to make sure that their civil rights are not violated? As a parent or guardian, they have the right to get answers when they need answers. Where parents can get support is to become a CHEM member, the Congress of Hispanic Educators. They can become a member. The links are on our COCABE website. And I also have links on the final slide, and this PowerPoint can be shared with all of you so that you can share it with families. What they're not telling parents is that it's not just closing a school. If you close a school, you're closing programs, you're closing transportation. So the Tinley program, which is the transitional native language program that is being used because of the consent decree, because kids were getting nothing. So now they have something. And so if the Tinley schools close, what happens to the program? If a bilingual school closes, what happens to the bilingual programming? Dual language programming. There was a Telemundo press conference that the Telemundo reported on, And the conference was at Colfax Elementary. They were told, parents first were told that there would be no more Tinley program. But then by time the story aired on Telemundo, DPS had retracted that statement, put a new statement in that said it would be a flexible Tinley program, which then, if that's flexible, you're talking about early exit, which is not supportive of native language development. It really exits the child, then by 3rd grade, they're done. They get no more supports in their native language. And so that can be risky because if a student is not ready and has not developed the reading and written strategies, then how can they carry that on? And what it does is that it purposely transitions students quickly to lose their native language and strip them of their language, which is not fair. So the summary of that consent decree, which directly affects the declining enrollment issue, and I've already stated when it happened, the decree provides the following for our English language learners, and we call them emergent bilinguals because we want to use asset-based language. They are emergent bilinguals because that's a gift to be able to provide our students with 2 languages and what they bring to the table with their native language. The decree provides the following for our parents. Parents have the right to demand a quality education for their students in their home language. Parents have the right to demand qualified teachers to teach their students in their home language. Parents, what they can do is they need to demand, not ask. At this point, they need to demand that they get information regarding the possible consolidation and closures, not after the fact. And it kind of feels not authentic in those committee meetings because it feels like the decisions have already been made. And this is more of a compliance issue that, well, we'll check it off the box. We had these committees. We went and had so-called meetings, but they're not structured to give parents voice. Parents need to demand that programming not be lost. If there's a transportation issue, which DPS has already spoke about transportation being an issue in their district, but if they now pass that on to the parents, now it's the parents' problem, right? It's like we consolidated or closed your school. How you get your child to school, DPS doesn't have a plan for that. They don't have a plan. And actually, that's not even a huge part of the conversation. We've been told in those meetings that we're only supposed to develop the criteria, not be discussing that yet. So I don't know when that's going to be discussed. If no one answers, they need to reach out to advocacy organizations like COCABE that we give voice to our students, families, and educators, and where support is needed. Parents have the right to reach out to the press. If they're not getting answers and going to the press is the only way they can get movement and get their voices heard, then they need to contact Univision, Telemundo. They need to contact Chocby. They need to contact, the Denver Post. They need to contact all outlets so their voices are heard. Parents have the right to protest. They have the right to say, we're not getting what we need, because in the end, all educators, we work for the families. That's who we work for. Parents have the right to request meetings. If the superintendent has not yet met with parents, if he has not yet met with the Spanish-speaking parents or other languages, other linguistic diverse families, then the DPS superintendent needs to meet with those families. He needs to answer their questions. He needs to be authentic in what he is sharing with them, and it needs to be real. There's email information, so you can email me. You can email Gladys Soto, who is our parent advocate for COCABE, Dr. Tanya Hogan, the executive director for Bueno. Here's a link also to the decrees in English and in Spanish, and to the CHE form so that parents can sign up for CHE. CHE will work with you on your complaints and what you are not getting from DPS. And those are the links that parents in English and Spanish, where they can get answers. Once they fill out that form, they'll be contacted by someone who can help support them with their concerns. And that's all I have with the updates for DPS declining enrollment. Are there any questions?
Dr. Trinidad, thank you so much for the overview. We appreciate your time and efforts in pushing back with the district with a lot of this inequities when it comes to language, especially with some of the monolingual Spanish speaker parents are in the committee. We've heard a lot of frustration from their end as far as not having the right tools for them to be successful. Within that, you share a little bit that the committee was tasked with the criteria. What are your thoughts on the process so far, as like the criteria that will be utilized to foreclosures or the mergers?
So thank you for your question regarding the criteria process. And it has not been authentic. And that's in all transparency. When the committee started, it seemed like the decisions are already made. We were handed a list of 3 points. This is part of the criteria. And then we pushed back and said, no, there needs to be this piece that's missing, such as the consent decree was not mentioned at all in the criteria. Not one word of that was mentioned. So we pushed back and said, it needs to be visible there. It needs to say consent decree. Then it was stated that bilingual programming, Tinley programming, dual language programming would be considered special programming, and that's all it needed to say in the criteria was special programming. Just like Montessori or special education or gifted and talented, they just wanted to put it under one umbrella as special programming. Well, again, that's kind of pulling the wool over the parents' eyes because you're not really being authentic and naming the programs. And so we pushed back at this last meeting and said, no, it has to say what the program is. Call it out, name what it is. Don't try to put it under an umbrella so that parents think, oh, well, I'm getting special programming. What special programming? What are you getting and what are you losing? And so they're trying to word it so that it seems like you're asset-based, that the criteria is going to be asset-based for the families, but in reality, it's not. It's not naming what's going to be lost. And they need to be honest about that. So that was another piece to the criteria. So, and also when we started the committee work, it was interesting to find out that another committee had been organized with organizations, with nonprofits. But the committees didn't know about one another really, and not really what the one work was being done by one group and the work that was being done by another group. So again, not authentic. And both groups haven't met together yet. So if we're building a criteria that we're going to hand to Marero, then how can the other organization that's meeting, the other committee, what is their process and what are they giving them to the superintendent? And so that seems like there's two different paths that are happening and they're not communicating with one another, which means then the parents and the families are not getting the proper communication as well. And so they need to be authentic, and it hasn't felt authentic in the process. And especially too with the facilitator of the committee not even knowing about the consent decree. How can you lead a group that of a district that has a legal binding document and you're going to set up a criteria, but you're not familiar with the legal document? How can you then hand down a criteria to the superintendent?
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, you mentioned there's another committee working on this?
So there's another committee of organizations that have been meeting, right, about the closures and about everything that's going on. But I didn't know about that committee, and several of us did not know who are on the declining enrollment committee that there was another group that's been meeting. And so it's like, what are the purposes? What are the purposes of having the two groups? Because FACE from DPS, they meet with that group, but then a member of FACE meets with the declining enrollment group. But we're not able to share experiences and what we're working on and the discussions. And so our families are getting mixed signals as well. There was a meeting at Castro Elementary and the interpretation and translation was poor. It was subpar, and our families felt like it was in a condescending way that they were being treated and not given the information. And so once again, our monolingual families, our culturally diverse families are getting school done to them and not working with them. And this is where DPS is failing. They're not working with the families. They're just doing it. And that's not right.
Just want to chime in really quick, Dr. Cynthia Trinidad-Sheahan. Thank you again for your hard work. You know, we have been pushing back on the district, especially with the lack of authentic community engagement as a whole, not just with the Spanish-speaking community, but with all of the other communities who will be affected by this. So we do have organizations that meet on Fridays, but for clarity, that's not a committee. That's actually just community organizations that come together that requested for DPS to have a community-facing info session, since the meetings are closed doors, the notes are very small, and we were like you were saying, there's not a lot of transparency with what's happening in the committee meeting. So that Friday meeting we don't have a say on what happens or how the communications get back. It's literally a continuous way to push back on the district for the lack of transparency on this process that has been flawed from the beginning, that does not really include our communities that will be affected, and that lacks really that commitment to celebrating language. So again, that process is super flawed, and I commend you for continuing to push the district. As community organizations, we are asking our parents and communities to show up and to ask these questions, but there hasn't been an authentic space for our parents and our community members to really show up and speak their mind. There was one meeting that was scheduled within 1 week, and that all of us who work in community know that a week is not enough to engage our parents in our community. And hearing from Aurora, we don't want to have the same issues that when the schools are closing, our parents have no idea what's going on.
Correct. And another piece is that the same with the declining enrollment committee. There are no minutes from the meetings. There is no recordings of the meetings. So it can, information is passed on as they see fit. I do strongly believe that, when Tramaine was talking about how the superintendent from APS has met and had town meetings, but there are several families who are culturally diverse, linguistically diverse families who have said they have yet to hear face-to-face from the superintendent of DPS. And that is wrong. I mean, we're already at the end of his first year. We're at the end of this school year, and he has yet to meet with those families to explain what's going on. And when our organization, as well as others, met with the superintendent, he shared that, well, the schools wouldn't close this year or next year, it'd be 2024. And so it's like, okay, so that's the message you're giving. And so it's already a done deal. So why are we wasting our time then getting a criteria that is going to be basically ignored? It feels like a compliance. Let's check the box. We had the committees, and now let's just move on. And it's not fair. And other things are not being considered with that, such as transportation, loss of programming, and what type of programming that's going to look like, and which schools. And they're blaming gentrification, transportation, all of these issues, but the families need to see the superintendent face to face. He needs to face the families and give them his time.
Cool. Are there any other questions for Dr. Cynthia Trinidad-Sheahan? All right, well, if not, we'll move on to our last presentation of our meeting today. And it's a video coming from Dr. Darlene Sampson, who lives by her late parents' mantra, which is giving back to others is in your DNA. You must respect and honor the shoulders you have stood on. With that thinking in mind, Dr. Sampson has maintained a space of social justice and culturally humility as she works across the education and social work fields as a mentor, administrator, leader, equity specialist, and instructor. Dr. Sampson is a principal diversity and equity analyst for the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center. The center provides diversity and equity consultation, training, and support in the Western region of the United States for K-12 schools. Dr. Sampson previous work is in schools as a director of culturally responsive education, manager of multiple research-based and mental health programs, and past child welfare experiences rounds out her professional experiences. Her lived experience as a Black woman assists her in infusing empathy for others, particularly around the intersectional spaces of gender and the social construct of race. Dr. Sampson's professional goals are to infuse culturally responsive consciousness, promote inclusive pedagogy, interrogate equity infusions, and promote organizational and systemic change. Dr. Sampson has a bachelor's degree in rehabilitation and psychology from the University of Northern Colorado, a master's degree in social work from the University of Denver, and a PhD from the University of Colorado, Denver. Her research and published work are focused in the areas of academic performance, specifically relating to Black and Indigenous students of color, parent engagement programs review and equity auditing, trauma responsive care, racial bullying, culturally responsive social work, and mental wellness, disproportionately and culturally responsive curricula augmentation. And then at the end of this, if you have any questions, Dr. Sampson did provide us her contact information to share out to the community.
So we never begin diversity work without having some sort of agreements. And so I'm just going to share with you some of the typical kind of agreements. It's okay to have an anxiety about race, diversity, and inclusion. That is called the pedagogy of discomfort, meaning that if we don't have some discomfort, we're not pushing ourselves, and we often aren't learning when we won't push ourselves, which really feeds into critical race theory. Pedagogy of discomfort. It will push you and make you feel uncomfortable. It's a term by Boler, B-O-L-E-R, and the discussion has to do with how this work can change us if we lean into it. When challenged, we also have to push ourselves first to understand our feelings. We don't push the group first, or we don't push the content first. We have to say to ourselves, what's coming up for me? Why is that making me feel strange? Why does that create some kind of issue for me? So think through what it is that comes up as I'm discussing, if anything comes up first. And then we have to approach the challenges and triumphs of our most vulnerable populations with a strengths-based perspective. And that's anchored in empathy and caring. So risk and truth is essential to this process. That's another critical race theory component. We can't talk about things unless we risk talking about the kind of issues that have been prevalent in this country. Take what you learn into your current space. That's important. And then we have to pursue positive intentions as a foundation for equity work, which is really a higher standard than assume positive intentions. We're just going to presume off the bat that people, even if they're challenged or they don't have the knowledge, underneath that, they do have some positive intentions. That's not the group that don't have positive intentions, but it is that group that want to learn, want to try, and are just, pushing for the work, but may not have the information. So some of what we discussed today may be uncomfortable, but the agreements help. And if we can kind of reflect back to them, it's going to be important. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint pretty quickly, and you have it recorded so that you can utilize it at another time. And again, I'm sorry I can't be with you, but perhaps there's another time that you come in person. I'd be happy to do that. So I'm going to try to anchor this as best I can. But all of the concepts have so much research and literature behind them. And I hope you make the connection from my presentation. So, are these concepts intersectional? The answer is yes and no. So I'll start with how they work together. So critical race theory, it's really just an interpretive frame that looks at societal structures and behaviors. And it's not a part of social emotional learning. So when people try to place those together, that's about something entirely different. And you can't even rationalize some of the thinking that's out there right now. I'll tell you how there's some possibilities of connection, but it's not anchored. Critical race theory is not anchored in social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is essentially anchors how we treat each other, how we care for each other, and it normalizes commonality. So I can find similarities with you, you can find them with me, but also if we're different, that's great too. It honors the difference, but it teaches self-control and builds safe spaces. We all need that in our schools. And then equity looks at inequitable structures, systems, policies, procedures, and behaviors that are embedded. And equity and CRT are really overlapping in their thinking because they're looking at structures, where social emotional learning is sort of an individualized view of what we need to do to be caring, be in control of our emotions, care for other people. So you can see that when I have the little red dotted line, that means that there's no real clear association between CRT and social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is often always has to do with the individual and teaching caring. And outside of the individual, it's being respectful and showing up to understand who's around you. And I essentially think my mother would say it's having good manners. That's what social emotional learning is. So when you hear these conversations, all of these concepts are not the same. They're being lumped together, but it's often because people are trying to incite others, trying to make others be afraid. Wow, what would we have? What kind of school would we have if we did not have social emotional learning where we teach our kids to take care of each other, respect each other? And those schools, by the way, who do not do social emotional learning, we know there are more critical issues that come up. We hear kids making racist statements. We hear kids putting down kids who need special education services. We see them making fun or bullying. And so social emotional learning really does support the structure of schools so that they are places of learning, but they're also safe places where people can be validated. So we know kids will make fun of each other and there's different issues that are happening, but the best schools are anchored in social emotional learning. So the concepts are loosely tied in, but social emotional learning it doesn't go into the structures and systems of the world and how they are challenging and inequitable. It's more about caring for each other. So those are the differences, and we need them, particularly social emotional learning in our schools. But it's pretty difficult when kids ask you about diversity and inequities, and you don't have a sense that social emotional learning is caring, but it's anchored in equity as well, because it cares for everybody in a way that meets their needs. But CRT, if I was to change this visual, I'd have CRT sort of sitting to the side. Social emotional learning has its own balance, so does equity, but equity should wrap itself around all of them. But social emotional learning should not be embedded in the CRT conversation. Go a little deeper. What is critical race theory? So the late attorney Derek Bell, he would probably be surprised that CRT is on the forefront of controversy in this country decades after he developed it. And he was a civil rights attorney, brilliant scholar, and he anchored the tenets of CRT. And so many people have added to it and expanded it. But Bell's civil rights roots created his thought process to better understand our country's history. So he's in law school and he's seeing all these systems of oppression and how they work together. And he just started to write about his experiences. So the framing, the theory of critical race theory came about as he saw the injustices, particularly to racialized minorities. Now, this is in law school. And Bell asserted that racism is so deeply rooted in all systems that there was no way he could successfully teach others the American system of justice without dissecting how all of this occurred. So that's how CRT began, as that interpretive frame, and it wants you to evaluate the foundation of this country. Our country has had many challenges. We're a great country, but we're also a country with some terrible injustices and historical spaces that we simply have to talk about because it's the truth. And so in the 1970s, legal scholars got together to really add to Derek Bell's framework, and they attempted to dissect systems and power coupled with human behavior, and really wanted to look at the interpretation of the world. I haven't seen CRT in schools. I have ran across really astute educators who really anchored in CRT and equity, and they can talk about it pretty well. But as far as it being about being embedded in a unit in a school, or being in social emotional learning, or a class on history, you don't see that a lot, because there's a couple things: who the books are written by, and number two, the acceptance of looking critically at history in schools. That's a challenge. Here and there, you might find educators who really know how to talk about critical race theory. They learned it in school, or they've read about it on their own. So all this talk of CRT is in schools simply isn't true. The curriculum is not written that way. Teachers are really structured in how they do the work. They have to be thoughtful and careful, precisely because of some of these issues. But I have ran into some educators who will say, now I'm talking about history of the indigenous folks, and we have to think about this concept. And this concept talks to us about power, race. And I particularly have seen it in relationship to talking about the criminal justice system. And as teachers talk about the new Jim Crow, the book in terms of discussing how our systems are continuing and being embedded and repurposed in different ways. But as far as being a part of a whole unit and taught from a perspective out of a book, no, that's not happening. So when people do that, you have to know that it means that they're trying to conflate the issue. It's a false narrative, and they're just not the same. So that's what critical race theory, how it got embedded by Derek Bell in the 70s. And it really was highlighting race, because nobody even talks about the fact that before critical race theory, there was critical theory. So I think people
Thank you all. And we have the link to this video that we can share with you just to honor everybody's time, which we'll put in the chat here shortly. So at this time, does anybody have any questions or reflections that they'd like to share within this space? Okay, if not, I'm going to go ahead and put Dr. Sampson's information in the chat. So this is how you can contact Dr. Sampson if you would like to ask questions directly to her, or if you had any, if you wanted to connect and collaborate, that is also the same information you can utilize. And so at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Dr. Cynthia Trinidad-Sheahan.
Thank you, Dr. Tracy Trinidad. So we want to make sure that as we leave today, that we also think about some questions that we can help support our families with, and questions we can be asking as well. And these questions are calling us to action, right? That we don't just come to the town hall meetings, or we don't just attend things, but that we get involved. And some of the questions that we need to talk about are, are there alternatives to supplement funding for the low enrollment? And this is where the superintendent needs to meet with our families face to face, so that parents can ask, well, what are some other options for funding? What are some things that DPS is thinking about to support those programs? How are schools that will potentially be affected by the declining enrollment? What's the criteria process look like? That has not been shared with our families. How is DPS thinking about authentically engaging families in the planning process? Have they involved the families? We have organizations, but we all work for the families, and that's what it comes down to. The communication. We need to demand better communication from the district, from the superintendent with our families, and to be transparent about what the thinking process is. And if the decision's already been made, quit wasting people's time and tell the truth. Tell the truth about where this is going, because families need to also know what their options are. The transportation issue, that's a challenge. This is another question parents can be asking. How is my child going to get to school if I can't? What if I'm undocumented and I don't have a driver's license? How am I supposed to get my child to school? Am I supposed to risk getting in trouble? Does DPS care about that? And so that's another issue that needs to be brought to the table. If schools leave programming, and they need to name the programming and not call it special programs, call it what it is. Are they going to lose bilingual programming? Are they going to lose Tinley programming? Are they going to lose gifted and talented programming? What is special education going to look like? These are all questions about programming that need to be answered, but they need to name the program specifically and not lump them all under an umbrella. Given that the list of schools the 19 schools that were being considered for consolidation and closure, we need to ask that question. Are these schools still the same schools? Which schools that drop below the 215 student enrollment are going to be merged with another school? How far is that for kids that have to walk? Or will they have to take public transportation? And then we need to stay informed, and that means reading your documents, right? We need to make sure that we're keeping up on the information that's being put out on the DPS websites. We need to know what the decree is. We need to understand what the drop in enrollment looks like. And this can also be another workshop that we as organizations need to support our families with, is having workshops that help explain funding to our parents. We can't just assume. We never should lead with bias and assumption. And when you lead with bias and assumption, you're leaving information out, right? We can't just talk about funding, hoping that our parents understand what that is, okay? Because we all know that hope isn't a strategy. And if we're going to talk about funding, let's have a workshop about funding and explain what October Count is. Let's explain to our families what Title I, Title II, Title III, ELPA funds, all these funding buckets. Do our families understand where the funding's coming from? And then we can hit the district with actions, right? What are they doing with that funding? So the call to action for a lot of organizations today, to all of you as leaders, to all of you even as parents, is talk to each other, parents, families, organization leaders. We need to start asking the DPS superintendent, APS superintendent, talk to the people face to face. Don't hide behind committees. Don't have committees just for compliance reasons. Let us ask you all of these questions face to face and give us answers, because you can't collaborate with a curtain. Any questions? And have a great day.
Thank you. So we'll take questions if we have any questions from our community at this time.
Hi, this is Liliana Saffron. I just want to say that I really admire the way that you advocate for families. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I know in the chat we had if we had any questions for Tramaine. I think Tramaine had a question earlier about, what does authenticity look like when, connecting with the community. So if anybody has suggestions that we can message to him, Valeria will be in contact. I would love for you all to inform him of, what does authenticity look like when communicating with the community.
This is Paola Ramirez. I just wanted to say, I think this is amazing to have all these people gathered together. I think there's more need for more meetings like this that are not tied to school districts, so that families and organizations can learn about bilingual education and can learn about their rights and can learn about different types of curriculum, different types of models. Even the transportation issue is affecting Latino children right now very specifically. But I also think that I'm a former bilingual teacher, and I know that there aren't that many people in Colorado that are really informed on bilingual education and acquisition to literacy and language. And I just think that one of the things that has to be continually revisited is just the benefits of, even if you're monolingual and you only speak Spanish, that is fantastic. Speak to your child, read to them, talk to them. That will translate into school. Many parents and many children are told to let go of that and to forget almost like their cultural heritage. And I think it obviously takes away from our potential, I think, and our like resources. And so I think that this is something that has to continually be revisited, is just the benefits of our cultural heritage, our language. So that new parents who are young parents will learn those skills and value it as well. And their children will too. I think it's really lonely to be a bilingual education teacher or to be a Latina teacher in schools. You're isolated, and you can tell even in the bilingual and even in the education conversations, just statewide, there aren't many conversations about these topics. It's about other things like GT or getting resources to kids money-wise, or high school transition to college. But the issues that were talked about today are not very aren't visited a lot by foundations or think tanks or advocacy groups.
No, absolutely, Paula. I would agree. It's kind of sad in a way that, you know, Colorado at one point in the 1970s was actually a focus state where bilingual education, Colorado was rocking it. They had the best bilingual education programs. They had cultural programming. I'm a product of that. I went to school in Fort Lupton, Colorado during that time, and bilingual education was thriving. You know, but it's sad that now with the school closures and things like that that's happening, our families are being treated very similar to how my grandparents were treated back in the 1950s, right? They're not getting their questions answered. My grandmother, who only spoke Spanish, tried to go to the school to advocate for my dad, for her children. And she was patted on the back and told everything will be fine and sent her home. And, you know, she felt that the only way then to help her children was for them to speak English and to learn English. And of course, you know, they did learn English at the sacrifice, though, of losing their language, which affected myself and my siblings. And many of us Latinos have gone through this. Our stories are very similar, where our language and our culture, and not just the Latino community, we look at our Asian communities as well. You know, language and culture, you have to sacrifice that to be successful in this country. That is a terrible message to be sending in a country that's diverse, that should be celebrating language. We should be doing all we can to make sure that our linguistically and culturally diverse families, that we hold on to our culture, our language, and we work together to have an outstanding programming. There is no excuse for us to not be celebrating bilingualism and multiculturalism. There's no reason why we can't do it. You know, we're taking steps backward instead of taking steps forward. And that's going to take everybody working together to have outstanding programming.
This is a very fitting. I'll send a flyer out later on once I get it translated, but I just met with some folks from the Language Preservation Project who will be hosting some sessions with parents of bilingual children to really talk about language preservation. So I think this is such an awesome subject for us to talk about and check in. I'm going to put a little bit of the description there. And to Dr. Cynthia Trinidad-Sheahan, this project is focused on Spanish here in Denver, but is actually looking at expanding for other languages as well, and to celebrate that cultural and the language is beautiful, and continue to support. And they provide books, and there's a little bit of stipend for parents to also do activities with their kids, but it's not just for parents. The beauty of this project is that it's also for educators. You know, how the educators are continuing to celebrate culture in the classrooms with extracurricular activities, with culturally relevant handouts and books to recommend for families. So as soon as I get the flyer, I will share it with all of you, because they are doing 2 cohorts of 15 to 20 parents and 15 to 20 educators that can take advantage of this. And as we're talking about it, seems like we're all passionate. So it is super awesome that the organization is actually based off out of state, but they did a lot of research base, and they signed a collaboration with DPS directly, and are looking for those parents from different communities to take part of this.
That's great. Thank you.
I just wanted to add that we'll be following up. When everyone registered, we got everyone's emails. And so you'll be receiving an email that might come through as like every action or my name, and with some notes, this video, as well as like other resources and events that people have plugged into the chat. And if you have any additional questions for people who can't be here, like Director Tramaine Duncan and Dr. Sampson, like, please send those our way and we can make sure that they have them, or you can reach out to them directly as well. But we're here to support, and we'll make sure we follow up with all of this for folks who registered and maybe couldn't make it, for you all to have and forward out to other communities or other people you think may be interested. So we will for sure be following up. And again, thank you everyone for being here. And I'm not ending the call. I just wanted to add that to make sure that folks are aware.
Thank you, Valeria. And please look forward email communications for, as we return in the fall for the school year, to continue to have these conversations around equity within our students' education, what's happening in the district. And also we will start to have conversations around critical race theory, just understanding what the conversation looks like outside of our bubble that's happening in other communities, just because we always have to know what's happening in bubbles that we necessarily might not agree with, just so we know how to have that conversation with people in our community, because they will be hearing, negatives and deficit lenses on critical race theory. And a lot of what we've been hearing it's not even critical race theory. So we will begin to have those conversations in the fall. So at this time, I want to thank everybody for attending this afternoon. And again, Valeria will be sending out information and then our contact information too, if you want to connect with us directly. I know that we would all be happy to stay in communication. Well, thank you all for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting.